So this first story is nothing too crazy. It's about me making my first drop-off by myself. I pull up to the mortuary around 10 p.m. Lights are off and the door alarm is on. So I flip those and bring the 2 bodies in. I'm weighing them and then I start hearing these thumps coming from inside the retort. I stop what I'm doing and I get really still. The ovens are off and there's just a humming from the fluorescents. I wait like 10 seconds and nothing happens, so I get back to getting the bodies boxed. Then I hear it again. A few muffled bangs from inside the retort. So I tell myself one of 2 things is happening. Either A, the retort's burning hot as shit during the day, with about 1800 degrees. They probably expand and contract as they cool, or there's a fucking grudge demon living in there and it's gonna scamper up the fucking ceiling and drop on me. I weighed both options in my mind and I decided that if it was a monster, then I was already dead. So best thing to do was get the job over with quickly and efficiently and go the fuck home. The next day I brought it up with the mortuary operator and he laughed and said that it was just them cooling. And so yeah, that was my first time being inside a mortuary. So all in all, it was kind of funny in hindsight. But hearing thumping sounds in the middle of the night kind of got me thinking. I was there really late into the night, like far past the time that it takes for the retort to cool. But even as I thought about it, I even accidentally placed my hand on it earlier when I walked into the room. And they weren't just cool, they were ice cold. On August 1st, 1999, funeral director Mark and his wife Alexi had a terrible argument leading to a huge fight. Alexi called her sister and told her about the spat between her and her husband. But her sister got worried when Alexi did not contact her after 3 days post the fight. Her missing report was filed and the investigation began. Families were doubtful that Alexi would abandon her 18-month-old toddler and walk out of the house. On the same day that police interviewed him, Mark hosted a closed casket funeral for 89-year-old Marjorie Hutchinson. The police had a reason to believe that Mark put Alexi's body in the same casket as Hutchinson and buried them together. 3 weeks after Alexi went missing, they confronted Mark and they told him that they were going to exhume Hutchinson's casket, so he confessed to stabbing Alexi in the heat of the moment. Mark didn't want to go through a costly divorce, and he didn't want to share custody of their son. He pleaded guilty, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. A friend of mine is a mortician. Her scariest incident happened very early in her career. She was alone and had music going, and was walking past the drawers when one of the bodies kicked the door and popped the drawer open just a crack. For context, she knew all about bodies hissing and moaning and having minor twitches as the nervous system starts to settle and degrade. But this was a rare and extreme case, where the major muscles and the leg gave a large twitch, causing a full kick. She had a full panic attack and took the rest of the day off, after calling the hospital admin, crying. I interned at a funeral home / crematorium in high school. I was goth and it was the perfect street cred internship. The funeral home owner was a nice guy, Phil, with a PH, and he was always introducing himself that way. He had a family and he was married, great sense of humor, bright personality, almost bubbly. About 8 to 9 months after my internship ended, Phil was forced to stop working. He had begun, according to him, to find worms inside of people. Long, white, wriggling worms, thousands of them filling people's bodies. He had to call the CDC, local doctors, hospitals, and other funeral homes on the West Coast, and no one else had found worms. But he began to find them inside every person that he worked on. He talked non-stop about the worms, first to his family, then to the family of the clients, and then to strangers. He had a total breakdown after an autopsy of a young boy somewhere between 6 to 8 years old who was almost entirely worms, according to PH. After his breakdown, Phil was pushed out of his business and it was sold to a national chain. About 6 months after being forced out, Phil killed himself. While I never got to read the note itself, his wife later told me that he had written about being able to feel the worms inside of him and not being able to stand it. He had begged his wife in the note to follow him and to also kill their children, as when he looked at his sons, all he could see were the worms inside of them. My first job was a funeral service involving transporting the recently deceased from the place of death to a mortuary service where they would be embalmed and prepping the bodies for final deposition, and then I would transfer them to the appropriate funeral homes. Anyway, one thing that really disturbed me was the way a fellow funeral professional treated the deceased in front of me. A woman who had recently died and was embalmed and prepped for a visitation at the mortuary service I worked for was ready for her final ride to the funeral home her living family members had selected. I prepped my van and cot to ensure I was near, professional, prepared, and on time. I switched into a suit and dress shoes and checked my hair, attempting to conceal the bags under my eyes and mentally prepare myself for the task at hand. I made it to the funeral home just fine. I was greeted by this rude funeral director who chewed me out for calling him to confirm parking details since I was new and not from the area. He already hated my guts. I double-checked and verified the ID of the deceased before I unloaded the cot and rolled her down the ramp into the prep room of the funeral home. Then, this awful man proceeds to roughly wheel in a dirty cot and tries to rip the poor woman off my cot and onto his. I asked him if he would like my help and he just tells me no. I stand back, feeling awkward, watching him wrestling, turning red and sweaty over her body. Next thing I hear him say, "Come on, you fat bitch." He yells through clenched teeth as he rips her away, and I was horrified. I was very new in the profession and I was kind of speechless by his behavior. I would never say that stuff in front of another person. I don't care if he thinks it's okay or not. It's not okay. You must have reverence for the dead, maintain the dignity of the deceased. It made me sick to my stomach thinking about it. He was not like this all the time. I hoped more that he never let family hear anything like that. I will never forget how disgusted I was by the one interaction. Another time, a young woman who was an international college student was struck at a homecoming parade by a drunk driver who was driving through barricades and ran down and killed several people, including one child. Anyway, this particular woman who was killed and at the morgue I worked with had to be sent to a medical examiner due to the mode and cause of her death. However, she was from India and her parents were devastated when we had to explain the autopsy, and her father fell to his knees crying because he feared the autopsy would go against their religion and was frowned upon. I'm not entirely sure of the details, but the image remains clear in my mind. I felt so helpless and so saddened by their grief. She was a beautiful young woman, studying for a degree and just died by some senseless human who wanted to drink and drive. I cried for her and her family. Her loss was too soon, and also preventable. I remember each and every face, from the stillborn infants to the self-inflicted gunshot wounds and gang violence-related deaths, to those my own age, which also hit me especially hard. I prayed for them, and treated them as if they were my own family. It was my job and my honor to usher them into the next realm, into the next chapter, and the next life. My neighbor a while back before I moved was a mortician. He didn't have any necessarily creepy stories per se, but one that sticks out concerned this one night that he had a body he was preparing for a very early morning wake or service. Whatever was going on, it was unusual, and it required him to work there into the wee hours of the morning on this particular corpse. So as he's working on it, he turns his back to grab some tools or supplies, and the angle that he was standing at with regard to the corpse left the body visible just out of the corner of his eye. As he was looking down at whatever tools he was getting, in the corner of his eye, he saw the body slowly start to sit up. His fight or flight instinct immediately kicked in, and he ran down the stairs as fast as he possibly could. But he was so clumsy trying to get up the stairs that he tripped and was pretty much crawling and clawing his way to the top. He was just near the top before his senses finally came back, and he knew that it was rigor mortis. He collected himself and started to laugh at how absurd it was. He had been doing this for about 15 to 20 years by this point, and he had never freaked out like that before, where instincts overtook knowledge and experience. He actually sheepishly admitted that he had to go clean himself because he had shit his pants in public. What was even crazier was that even though he knew what had happened, he still felt odd going back down to the prep room because he had this silly thought in his mind that as he neared the bottom of the stairs, the body or person would come around the corner and scare him. He had to very carefully peek around the corner to make sure that the corpse was still sitting there and not wandering around the prep room. Of course it was, and he felt even sillier. I spent some time picking up bodies for the medical examiner. There are many stories, some of them my own and some of those of whom I worked with. One of which is usually popular is that of a woman who died on her own in the reservation town. We arrived and the cop on scene was quite disgusted with the place. He was looking forward to being deployed back to Afghanistan to get away from this town. The house when we arrived was an older house with several stories. The fence outside had been driven through by a car at some point. It was at night, of course. We entered the house and it was a complete mess. She was obviously a bit of a hoarder. I've seen much worse hoarders in my day, but she was on her way there. There was stuff piled everywhere. You couldn't even tell what the floor was actually covered in because of all the garbage and paper and stuff all around. Probably hardwood underneath as it felt very solid, but tough to say for sure. The second floor was up a spiral staircase. Great, and she was upstairs. Before we went up there, the cop told us that the dogs had got at her a little bit. We worked our way up the spiral staircase to the door that was indicated that she was behind. When we opened the door, there was a body sitting in an office chair facing the door. However, it was a skull on top of a body. The dogs had eaten away all of the skin on her head. They also ate her breasts, and the implants from her breasts were on the floor. She had several small dogs. They all started eating each other before her. So there were bones from at least one, probably two dogs scattered around. She had died and was not able to feed the dogs, obviously, so they turned on each other, and then to her. The guy I was with started freaking out a little bit. It was a fairly disgusting sight, well beyond the average call that we went to. You're trying to figure out how to get her out of the chair. She was decomposed, of course. She was also covered in blisters that bodies get covered in as they decompose. We have to gather as much as the body as we could, so we grabbed her implants and what was left of her scalp, with the hair attached on the floor. You don't want to pop the blisters if you can avoid it. They are very putrid when they leak out. In my partner's state of not knowing what the hell to do with her, he decided that the easiest way to get her out of the chair was to kick the chair out from under her, and so he did. She came crashing down on the floor, and the blisters burst. It was now a horrible mess of oozing pus. We had our portable stretcher, as obviously we weren't going to bring the ones with wheels up the spiral staircase. We don't generally bring that up staircases at all, really. We set up the body bag and loaded her in. Of course, some of the fluids and whatnot got on the outside of the body bag. We loaded her on the stretcher and carried her out of the house. She stank up the minivan all the way down to the city. It was winter and quite cold out, but we had to drive all the way there with the windows down to try to survive the putrid odor. We had an older lady, maybe mid-60s, who looked like a beautiful, youthful 40-year-old from the chest up, and like Frankenstein's monster below that. I'm talking numerous heavy scars all over, misshapen areas on her torso, lots of discoloration and fluid buildup. She looked like she had been attacked by a lawnmower and crudely stapled back together. Come to find out, she was really into plastic surgery, and even though she had an expensive, well-recommended surgeon, things started to go wrong. She got infections. Her body wasn't responding well to the surgeries. and every procedure done to fix the previous one just went worse. They pretty much turned her into a living meat puzzle. My grandpa was the mortician for a small town in the late 60s. The morgue was attached to the house that my mom lived in. And one day, her boyfriend, Tom, came over to the house, and no one was home. They had been dating for a while, and he was comfortable with going inside waiting for my mom to come home. On the way into the house, Tom noticed the door and the windows into the morgue were open. So he checked it out, found it empty, closed everything, and went into the house. A few minutes later, he heard a loud slamming noise coming from the morgue, so he ran to see what was wrong, and found that the doors and the windows had been thrown fully open again. And he got out of there real quick. When he told my grandpa about what happened, my grandma just calmly explained that they had picked up a deceased woman that morning, and the spirits were there welcoming her and visiting with her. Next time, Tom should just leave the doors and the windows open. In 1988, a 51-year-old experienced funeral director would always advise families of the deceased not to watch the body as the casket is being lowered in, for it may be difficult for the families. While families heeded his advice, once when he gave the grave spit, the family of the deceased walked a little away but kept an eye on Wilks. That's when they saw Wilks throw some potted flowers into the grave and aided him put the lid on the vault. A $375 add-on that Wilks had sold them. They went to the police and they arrested Wilks. The only way to check the claims of others who complained against him was to exhume bodies that were buried by Wilks, and 30 graves in all were dug up. At least 10 coffins were stuffed with large, garbage-like bottles, dirty diapers, used cans of dog food, and bags of hair. At least 2 coffins were buried on their side and one with an arm sticking out of the coffin. That suggested that Wilks didn't lower the caskets. They were just dumped in. In October 1989, Wilks pleaded guilty to 48 different charges and was sentenced to 28 years and 11 months in prison. So this story is from a friend of a friend. She, the mortician, met up with some guy at the bar. They hit it off and she gave him her number. And within a couple of days, she finds out that the guy died in a car accident because his body ended up at her place of work. Before the funeral service, she receives several phone calls from an unknown number, and whenever she picks up, there was no response. Eventually, she got the eerie hunch that maybe it was him, and proceeded to address him by name, tells him to pass in peace, and then the calls stopped happening. I was once trapped in a morgue alone during a hurricane. Our morgue was basically in a basement type situation, and the hospital was near a main waterway that flooded. I had to move all of the bodies to the highest cabinets, pray for the generators that they would keep everyone cold, while standing on my desk for about 2 hours when someone finally came for me. One bizarre incident that I had was a drowned guy who was DOA, and once locked up in a cabinet, a tapping noise started coming from him. It ended up being a crab that had made itself a home inside of him, and when it got cold, the crab wanted out. One creepy story I have is that of when taking care of the bodies of people who were doing bath salts. People tend to think that they look rather strange and even creepier. But here's the thing. They look even more so in death. So, I'm not a mortician, but this comes from my mother back when she was a teenager. Guy she knows takes a job with the local funeral home. He works the graveyard shift, and all is well for the first few months. Dude is often weirded out at work, claims that the building is haunted. Earlier in the evening, they got a call from the hospital saying that they have a lady there ready for pickup. They pick her up, and Guy is freaking out, saying that he has a bad feeling. Later in the evening, Mortician has to step out for a bit, leaving Guy there alone with a dead body. He goes about his work, still a little freaked out, when suddenly he hears this low, soft moan. He swears it's just his mind playing tricks on him and goes about his business. He hears it again, a little louder this time. It is late and he is alone, and he just starts hearing things, probably just the pipes settling. The plumbing is old after all. Short time passes and it starts to get louder, and at that point he's sure he isn't just imagining things. He knows he's hearing the dead lady moan. His first thought was the mortician was fucking with him. He has been shaking all evening and this asshole is pranking him. He marches over. "Very funny, you dick." Yanks back the sheet covering the dead lady, expecting to find the mortician somewhere around her. But then the dead lady grabs the guy's wrist, and he lets out a scream and bolts for the door, forgets his car, and runs all the way home. As it turns out, the old lady wasn't dead, and the hospital got it wrong. She had been in a coma or something, and they had been sure that she had passed on earlier in the morning. She woke up in the funeral home and scared the ever-loving hell out of the assistant. He quit the next day. She said that he said he would never ever set foot there again. A man who murdered 2 women, then used a hospital job to prey like a vulture on more than 100 dead women in a mortuary whose bodies he sexually assaulted, has been told by a judge that he will die in jail. Victims of David Fuller, 67, gave harrowing accounts of the suffering his psychopathic offending caused, with him videoing his necrophilic attacks on girls and women aged from 9 to 100. The mother of the youngest victim said her daughter had been raped as she lay in the mortuary with another whose loved one was attacked, saying women were not safe when alive, nor in death. The government has ordered an independent inquiry into how Fuller was able to offend for so long. Fuller first stalked and murdered 2 young women in Kent in 1987, and for 33 years seemed to have gotten away with his crimes, before admitting to them during a trial in Maidstone Crown Court. A DNA breakthrough led to him being identified as the prime suspect, and when police raided his home in December 2020, they uncovered hard drives full of attacks on the dead and material downloaded from the internet showing extreme pornography, including of children. Fuller murdered Wendy Nell, 25, and Caroline Pierce, 20, in separate attacks in Turnbridge Wells in 1987. Both were sexually assaulted, and he had planned his attacks. The judge, Mrs. Justice Shamima Grubb, handed down a full life sentence at Maidstone Crown Court. Having killed 2 women who were full of promise of life, you become a vulture, picking your victims from among the dead, with the hidden world of hospital mortuaries, which you were left free to inhabit simply because you had a swipe card, she said. The depravity of what you did reveals that your conscience is seared, calloused over. The sentence that I am passing means that you will spend every day of the rest of your life in prison. Fuller's necrophilic attacks are believed to be the most extensive offending of their kind in British legal history. He admitted the murders and attacks during his trial. He used his job as a hospital electrician to enter the mortuary of 2 Tunbridge Wells hospitals, where from 2008 to 2020, he sexually abused 102 dead bodies. There was no CCTV where the attacks took place. The prosecutor, Duncan Atkinson, QC, said about 20 victims were yet to be identified, while 82 had been identified. David Fuller systematically and repeatedly sexually abused the bodies of dead women and girls, Atkinson said. In interviews after his arrest, Fuller claimed not to have derived sexual pleasure. He recorded the abuse, taking video footage and photos which he later watched, then cataloged them according to the types of attack. Some recordings had the names of victims. One Fuller was entitled, "Best Yet." Court also heard a TENS machine that normally offers pain relief via electrical stimulation was recovered from Fuller's home when it was raided by police. For most of Wednesday morning, Maidstone Crown Court heard accounts of the searing emotional toll from those loved ones who had been violated by Fuller, told of their shock when police told them the details, in some cases, years after they lost their loved ones. If they had been alive, the victims would be suffering crimes equivalent to that of rape. The mother of the youngest victim faced Fuller, telling of the catastrophic pain he had caused, and said toys she left in memory of her lost daughter were moved. "You, my baby. To me, this is in the most unimaginable way." The mother also added, she could not say no to the dirty 66-year-old man who abused her body. "It makes my skin crawl, and it really breaks my heart." She told after her child's death, she had brushed her lost daughter's blonde hair and felt guilt because she had left her in a place she believed to be safe. The court heard accounts of people left anxious as virtual recluses, betrayed, and in some cases, on medication. The father of one of the attacked said, "I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't get these thoughts and images out of my head. You have proved in your depravity that monsters are very real." Some came to court in person, some had their statements read by the prosecutor, and others asked for statements to be read by the judge in private. Another person whose loved one was attacked said, "In a world where women are not safe when they are alive, they are not safe when they are dead." The father of an 18-year-old victim said, "Fuller has taken our little girl's innocence and destroyed our souls. I am consumed with anger." One husband who lost his wife said, "David, when you were serving your time behind bars, think carefully about what you have done and thank your lucky stars that I am not the one who is sharing a cell with you."